Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to declare my bias, first of all, my allegiance. I'm coming at this from very much an urban design perspective, and within that probably even more towards the design bit of urban design, if you like. My interests lie, in particular, to do with urban design theory and how that body of knowledge, fascinating as it is, can relate to what we actually do, what we design, what happens, what gets built. That was something that came originally from my own rather feeble attempts to use things like the work of the situationists, if some of you are familiar with those crazy ideas, to try and actually generate design from those principles, and from the work of Alexander Cuthbert and his critique of urban design theory. The work I'm going to present today is sort of based on my PhD work, which looked at trying to examine how normal design might be influenced by urban design theory in amongst that really complex and constrained context of all the other things we have to do with, like budget and site and regulation and policy and clients and users and all these things. And I haven't explicitly previously actually really been asked to think about place as a discrete element within urban design. I suppose, similar to Linda, I considered it to be almost embedded within what we do in some ways. It's been quite an interesting process to then try and extract from this what the relationship is perhaps between the urban design theory, design process, and the eventual essence of place or placelessness. I looked at literature to try and understand what's going on to begin with, and I did this in two separate areas. I looked at urban design and theory in that area, sort of the context, if you like, and also then the design process. In terms of urban design, I think maybe we're all familiar. There's very little consensus about what that is exactly. There are a lot of different definitions, a lot of them perhaps a little meaningless, if I was to agree with Alexander Cuthbert. But there is a feeling that it's quite a conflictive process, and something in which the urban designer has to negotiate multiple and at times really competing interests in, and I'm going to use Castells here, the symbolic attempt to express urban meaning in certain urban forms. There's also within it obviously lots of different elements, and as I said, I really focus a lot on the creative element. Alexander Cuthbert argues for a social science basis for the discipline of urban design, proposing that it's rooted within spatial political economy, but he acknowledges that link to architecture and planning, and the approaches, therefore, that are more common to art and design. Ali Madanipour describes it as the creative process of urban design, as opposed to the technical and the social processes of urban design, in which the individual designer uses his or her skills, knowledge, and judgment to develop spatial proposals distinct from those other areas. Theories. Well, it's kind of a big area. Now, what do we mean by theories? And I focus particularly on the idea that there's a sort of a body of work that's within urban theory. It's not looking also at the sort of social theories and these kind of broader things, but specifically urban design theory, which a lot of authors draw down into procedural theory, theories of urban design, and substantive theories, theories in. Those being the ones that study the discipline's own operations, providing observations and explanations of urban phenomena or processes. So these are ones perhaps we're more familiar with and might fall into the category of things that have been brought up today. It's this type of theory, substantive theories in urban design, that's suggested by a number of authors, Wolf and Shin, Donald Chern, Ali Madanipour, Cliff Morton, John Lang, and Carmona and Teasdale, that might be in some way tested by the process of designing, might be applied in some way. But beyond that, there's actually not an awful lot of discussion of specifically at the sort of really detailed end where you put pen to paper how that happens. So what about the design process then? Well, literature generally all agrees that it's something that has several stages that can be recognized. Although there's another approach, of course, that says, no, it's a mystical, magical thing that happens and we won't explain it. But if you study it basically, you could, even if you're not doing it consciously, understand that there are a series of things like defining the problem, generating alternatives, synthesizing these alternatives that happen through different points in the process. So within that, what influences it? As I mentioned, there are a lot of things that are very obvious, like policy and regulation, budget and the brief that you're dealing with, you're responding to. But there's also some ideas in the literature that it has really sort of tacit notions, some implicit influences that perhaps we're not conscious of when we're designing. As I said, there's a range of things. These are discussed as being the guiding principles of an individual designer. Site analysis, constraints, precedents is quite a popular one, and of course our personal experiences. So, occasionally theory is mentioned as a possible influence, sometimes broadly described as theoretical constructs, sometimes as currently accepted paradigms, but there's little clarity about how this relationship actually occurs. And there are some indications actually that designers are supposed to prefer episodic knowledge, using precedents and things that we're familiar with, rather than using semantic knowledge, theory, as a way of generating design. And interestingly, two of the most prolific contributors to literature on the design process in generic terms, Lawson and Cross, don't include theory in their model of the design process. So really this gap led me to ask, in which ways might theory influence the individual creative design process of urban design? And I've stolen Professor Lang's model of the urban design process here to not endear myself to him, which would be awful, but I genuinely find this very useful because it's one of the few ones that does actually include urban theory as something which features in the whole process and might feed into it. And here you can see I'm trying to highlight exactly which bit of this I'm addressing. Of course, there's a broader urban design process that deals with implementation at one end, and also the engagement of stakeholders at various points, and a whole administrative process. But really, I'm just interested in the bit where the individual designer is generating ideas, testing them, responding to a brief, and moving through that. I approach this using using a research by design methodology. So by that I mean using design as a way of still meeting the normal academic criteria for research, but using the actual generative process of design as a way of investigating. I won't go into this in lots of detail, but I think I define a few different models of this, and basically they're just different ways of the design interacting with the textual output of the research and having a different role within it. So for example, you could use a speculative approach, in which case the theoretical investigation leads to a design speculation rather than a textual conclusion. You have a speculation through design of what one outcome might be. But the one I've worked with when trying to look at theory in the design process is a reflective approach. And really that's based on ideas of Donald Chern and his argument that the way a professional thinks in action, the way he reflects in action, can allow tacit knowledge to be uncovered. And in this case, obviously, look at applying that to the individual design process to try and see, just in a normal process of design, what are the different actors in that decision-making process. So he argues that we know more than we say. We exhibit a kind of knowing in practice, most of which is tacit. Knowledge is created when the practitioner responds to situations by examining practice reflectively and reflexively, leading to developmental insight. So in terms of approaching this as a piece of research, then it might suggest that the design process is made explicit by keeping a sort of diary or commentary of your activity, and then the designer reflects back on that retrospectively in relation to the established context of existing knowledge to gain new insights. I will just whiz through the sort of site that I took to facilitate this examination. The site itself, of course, didn't really matter. The question was nothing to do with a specific place. That might be a problem for today, I don't know. But it was somewhere that had all the sort of prerequisites. It had enough space to make an intervention. It had a live brief that I could react to. and it's quite an interesting bit. This is London, obviously, you will know, and I was focusing on Croydon down here, which is the largest borough of London in terms of population. To give some pictures now, quite pretty. It's a place that is characterized by 1960s and 70s urban design and planning principles. It was bombed very heavily in the war, and so it was rebuilt at a time where, therefore, those were the sort of dominant forces. The car needs to go fast, people don't really matter too much, we're just going to separate all the modes, and it's zoned in a very sort of monofunctional, horizontal way. This might be a good point to add that there's an interesting separation, I think, coming through from what we talk about today about whether we talk about place as being necessarily what we think is good in terms of urban design, that if there is a sense of place that is good, and it's good urban design, and separate to what might actually be placeless, because although this might not be what all of us would think is really a nice environment and follows what is currently thought of to be good urban design principles, I would argue that there's a very strong sense of place. There's a really strong character to this area. One of the advantages of the area is that it has really amazing connections into central London. Really fast, really frequent, very unusual for that far out. So there's a lot of pressure and demand and opportunity to develop it. And some very vibrant parts of it as well. To give you an idea of what I did, I went through a normal process. I did a site evaluation, looking at the socioeconomic, physical, cultural aspects, physical aspects of the place, and developed an urban design framework, and then a master plan within that area. So this is just some examples from the site evaluation, where I'm looking at the character of a residential area, trying to understand what the components of that are. Looked at demographics and compared it to other places, put it in its context. Land use, and trying to, again, just understand the place, density, as well as, of course, the policy context. When it comes to the framework, I was working on a sort of two-dimensional, long-term strategic level to try and come forward with some proposals for that, which took a particularly sort of transit-oriented approach to build on the advantages of that area. And then when it gets down to the master plan level, I'm looking at developing a particular area within it and looking at the built form and open space. It gets to 3 dimensions, looking at the street sections and how you work that up. Really quite sort of typical stuff. And that was the final master plan. So in terms of addressing the research questionnaire, none of this stuff really mattered. The product was in many ways less important than the process. I kept this design commentary alongside the activity, which is what you're seeing here, this really beautiful tabular stuff that I know looks very dry. And the purpose of that was just to record the immediate thinking, the immediate reasoning, sort of like Schoen's reflection in action. And each entry is one sort of stage, and then they're correlated to the sketches that were at that point in the process. So in the case illustrated here, this is from the master plan. I'm considering a new layout of built form and open space. I'm trying to incorporate an extra route through the site. And I've recorded at the time that my aim was to try and improve integration, which is obviously really linking back quite directly to the ideas of Bill Hillier and space syntax theory. So I use space syntax as an actual tool to evaluate the different options and choose one way forward. So in this case, theory is being used quite explicitly through established methods and techniques, and that action requires very little interpretation on the part of the designer. In this example, from the framework stage, I'm looking at Peter Calthorpe's transit-oriented development. And this has been prompted by the identification of several aspects, the need for east-west connections, the extent of the tram network, and I seek guidance from his theoretical ideas to unify and strategize the alternatives. So I'm clarifying it by sketching abstract representations, and again, this is going from abstract to specific, but not through a given method. There's much more interpretation required to apply this to a specific site. And this final example supports the idea of tacit knowledge and use of theory in the design process. I'm working around one issue here, the spatial aspects of movement, prompted by the framework objectives. And although people argue in the literature that designers often frame a problem in a way that's personal to them, this seems to be valuing things like integration, connectivity, permeability, and the pedestrian use of space. And these are all terms and ideologies that are really embedded in urban design theory, suggesting that there's some underlying influence there. So I came up with a few findings, that theory is used predominantly in a range of ways. It does seem to be used. That it's used as a tool for analysis of the existing and the proposed, that it's used as a source of guidance that is actively sought by the urban designer for the basis of design decisions, but also as an underlying source of guidance which is tacitly informs the decisions we make. Perhaps these are quite predictable findings in a way. So, what does that mean for our debate on place and placelessness? Well, I think if we're to accept for a moment that urban design theory does influence both explicitly and implicitly the development of design proposals, we could look at the individual theoretical subscriptions. I'm going to borrow Roger Simmons' ideas that basically urban design theory could be lumped into conservative reformers and radical reformers. The conservative reformers are people like Jane Jacobs, Responsive Environments, Gordon Cullen, Kevin Lynch, and they're really deriving their principles from the traditional cities, and they're likely to be involved in the repair of these kind of contexts. They are basically trying to connect new social and economic activities into traditional patterns of built form and open space. The second type of conservatives, which has come up a few times today, is perhaps these the new urbanist sort of move, the neo-traditional group, who whilst rejecting the emergent new city on the basis of its sort of unsustainability, really sort of follow more of a traditional pattern in terms of architectural aesthetics as well. I mean, we came up today earlier this idea of authenticity and to what extent then that's authentic. And the radicals, some examples would be Koolhaas and Venturi. You know, they're embracing the form of the new emergent city. It leads to things like retail parks, business parks, volume housing, and they don't see that as necessarily a negative thing. At the moment, of course, at least in the UK, and I would say Europe and perhaps here as well, that's not the dominant paradigm. It's exciting. That one did have images on it, trust me, but it doesn't here, just showing how perhaps my own subscription to what is more a traditional conservative reform approach theoretically uses, perhaps responds more to place. You know, we try to respond to place in the way that Linda was describing. You try to understand the site, you try to understand the character, and do that analysis work to make something responsive to its environment. And things like this, trying to understand which local landmarks, obviously some reference to Lynch there and his theoretical ideas, would retain a sense of place, even if you're changing a lot of the stuff around it, what their form are people attached to that would still retain a sense of place. So just to finish, really, some questions that I'm thinking about. Could the theoretical bias of an individual designer lead to greater or lesser degree of place or placelessness? If someone takes a more radical reform basis, is that going to develop more placelessness than if you take a conservative reform approach? And if this is the case, would a sort of paradigm shift in the field where we move away from the conservative reform, from Bentley, from Cullen, actually lead to a rise of the placeless phenomenon? And is that, in fact, just a representation of a new societal shift, as Castell's reference to symbolic meaning of society is reflected in urban form? Perhaps that's quite right that we should be reflecting that. I also wondered if, and this came up earlier in John's talk, the increased degree to which urban design services are internationalized, and Linda mentioned it too. Perhaps that transience, that transportability means that these principles, these theoretical principles, are being taken out of their original context because they're basically coming from sort of European historic basis and taken to other parts of the world, which creates a kind of unusual juxtaposition. So are we tacitly implying theoretical principles of urban design derived from one context to somewhere else? And these are all things I'm generally still thinking about, so I look forward to your comments on them. Thank you.